Hi everyone, welcome to Lab 6, Histology. At this point in lab, we've talked quite a bit about cells, and remember that a cell is the basic unit of life, and because cells are living things, each cell is able to perform all of the functions necessary to sustain life. But in humans and other multicellular organisms, these cells do not operate independently. Instead, they work together in tight-knit communities to maintain homeostatic conditions within the body. These tight-knit communities of cells are called tissues. In today's lab, we will talk about the types of tissues that you find in the body, and afterwards you will research each specific tissue, identifying main characteristics for each tissue, including a basic description, function, and location for each tissue that you find in the body. But what are tissues? Tissues are groups of cells that are similar in structure and perform a common function. The study of tissues is called histology, and there are four primary types of tissue that make up the human body. Those four primary tissue types are epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. The figure that you see on the screen here is an example of an epithelial tissue. At the end of your unit on histology, you should be able to identify this specific tissue as well as the other tissues that you find within the body. Before we look at specific tissues, however, we're going to talk about each of the four primary types of tissue, beginning with epithelial tissue. The epithelium is a sheet of cells that covers a body surface or lines a body cavity, and this covering and lining epithelium forms the outer layer of your skin. It lines the open cavities of the cardiovascular, digestive, and respiratory systems, and covers the walls and organs of the ventral body cavity. So the lining of your blood vessels, your digestive tract, and your windpipe are all composed of epithelial tissue. You should recall from your first class, one of the things you talked about were the two main cavities of the body, the dorsal body cavity and the ventral body cavity, and specifically you looked at the ventral body cavity and the membranes associated with it. Among those membranes include the peritoneum, the pericardium, and the pleural membranes. All of those membranes that you looked at that first week in class are all composed of epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissue has a variety of functions, including protection, secretion, absorption, excretion, filtration, and various sensory functions. We'll talk about a couple of these functions in more detail, beginning with protection. Where might you find an example of an epithelial tissue that serves to protect your body in some way? The best example here is your skin. Your skin is a protective barrier, protecting your underlying tissues from various harmful substances that could potentially damage those tissues. For example, living on your skin are millions of bacteria, but your skin prevents those bacteria from getting into and infecting underlying connective tissues. If, however, that skin is broken, the bacteria that live on your skin may then have a way to get into those deeper tissues and cause an infection. But if your skin remains intact, it serves as an effective barrier to those bacteria, and again, it protects that underlying tissue from infection. Let's focus on filtration. Where might you find epithelial tissue whose job is filtration? A good example of epithelial tissue involved in filtration is the tissue that comprises the capillaries that you find in your kidneys. Remember, it's your kidneys that filter your blood and produce urine. And as that blood is filtered, it passes through capillaries composed of a thin epithelial tissue. And it's the passing of the blood through that tissue that allows the blood to be filtered. Now, the remaining functions that you see listed here, you'll go into more detail with when you begin looking at specific epithelial tissues. In addition to the covering and lining epithelium, there's also a glandular form of epithelial tissue. And the glandular epithelium comprises both endocrine and exocrine glands. In lab, however, we will not go into detail regarding the structure and function of glandular epithelium. So from this point forward, keep in mind we're talking about the covering and lining type of epithelial tissue. There are 7 important characteristics of epithelial tissue that you should know, and the first of which is that epithelial tissues have a limited amount of matrix. Matrix is extracellular material. In other words, it's stuff that you find around the cells that comprise a tissue. In epithelial tissue, there's very little, if any, matrix that surrounds the cells in the tissue. So essentially what we have with epithelial tissue is one big sheet of cells, okay, with no extra stuff between them. Matrix is something that you'll come back to and talk about in more detail when you look at specific connective tissues. The second major characteristic of epithelial tissue is that these tissues exhibit polarity. And by that we mean that each tissue has 2 different sides. Okay, to better illustrate that, let's take a look at the figure on the right-hand side of the screen. Notice that in this figure there are 2 different sides of the tissue labeled. The upper surface is labeled the apical surface, and the lower surface is the basal surface. The apical surface is the outermost exposed layer. This is the section of epithelial tissue that points toward the external environment or toward an open space of a hollow organ, such as your digestive tract. So for example, when you look at your skin, you're looking at the apical surface of that epidermal tissue. The basal surface is the second attached surface. So the basal surface is important in that it plays a role in attaching the epithelial tissue to underlying connective tissues. And that brings us to the third main characteristic of epithelial tissue, the presence of a basement membrane. Okay, the basement membrane is important because it basically serves as the way in which that epithelial tissue is connected or anchored to underlying connective tissues. The basement membrane itself is composed of 2 layers of tissue, including the basal lamina and the reticular lamina. The basal lamina is a thin sheet of tissue that adheres to the underlying connective tissue, and it's important because it acts as a selective filter, which means that it allows only certain things to move from the underlying connective tissue up into the epithelial tissue. The reticular lamina is deep to the basal lamina, and it's composed of collagen and protein fibers that belong to the underlying connective tissue. So again, it's these 2 layers, the basal lamina and the reticular lamina, which combine to form the basement membrane, which serves to anchor the epithelial sheet to the underlying connective tissue. The basement membrane is also important because it reinforces the epithelial sheet, helping it to resist the stretching and tearing forces that happen on it as we move our bodies. The fourth main characteristic of epithelial tissue is that these tissues are avascular, which means that there is no direct blood supply in epithelial tissue. So in other words, there are no blood vessels within the tissue itself. Because there are no blood vessels in the tissue, oxygen and other nutrients must diffuse from capillaries that are in the underlying connective tissue through the basal lamina, through the basement membrane, and into the epithelial cells. The epithelium is essentially one big sheet of connected cells, and the way in which those cells are connected is a reflection of the particular tissue's function and location in the body. The figure that you see on the screen here shows you examples of several types of membrane modifications. These are alterations to the plasma membrane that allow cells to stick together. So take a moment and examine the 4 sets of cells that you see in the figure. Notice that the 2 cells in figure A are not connected, and their plasma membranes have not been modified in any way. So here we have 2 regular cells that haven't been altered at all. Okay, now compare the 2 cells with no alteration that you see in figure A with the 2 cells that you see in figure B. Okay, you should immediately notice that in figure B, those 2 cells are connected to each other. Their plasma membranes have been fused together or glued together, forming what's known as a tight junction. Now, tight junctions are very important because they prevent certain substances from leaking out into surrounding tissues. Okay, so we find tight junctions in several places in the body, particularly in the lining of the digestive tract. Okay, if you think about your colon, for example, okay, fecal material passes through your colon and is eventually eliminated from the body. Okay, if the epithelium that lines the colon becomes damaged in any way, which sometimes happens as a result of a colonoscopy, then that fecal material can leak out of the bowel, out of the colon, and into the surrounding tissue, where it will cause a very serious infection. Okay, but normally, though, we have this epithelial lining in which the cells are connected by these tight junctions that prevents that fecal material from leaking out of the colon into that surrounding tissue. So these tight junctions here are very, very important. All right, now compare the cells that you see in Figure B with those that you see in Figure C. Okay, notice that in Figure C, like in Figure B, the two cells are connected. But in Figure C, the two cells are connected by thin purple threads. Okay, those thin threads that you see in Figure 3 there are connecting proteins. And this type of membrane modification is called an adhering junction or a desmosome. This type of membrane modification you find between the cells of your skin. So again, in comparing the cells that we see in Figure B with Figure C, okay, in Figure B there we see that in the tight junction, okay, the plasma membranes of those two cells have been directly connected, they've been glued together, whereas in Figure C the two cells are being held together by connecting filaments, connecting proteins. Okay, now focus your attention on the cells that you see in Figure D. Notice that in Figure D, the two cells are connected, okay, but unlike the other two modifications that we saw, okay, in Figure D, those two cells are connected by channel proteins, okay, which are represented by the orange rectangles that you see there. Okay. Those channel proteins allow the cytoplasm of one cell to be directly connected to the cytoplasm of the adjacent cell. And because the cytoplasms of the cells are connected, that means that those cells are able to efficiently communicate with each other by sending signals from one cell through that channel protein to the other. This type of membrane modification is called a gap junction, and it's important in several tissues, including cardiac muscle and smooth muscle. If you think about your heart, for example, okay, your heart is a muscular pump, and it pumps in a very coordinated fashion. Okay? Because its cells are connected by these gap junctions, it ensures that each of those cells are going to contract and work together as a unit to make sure that the heart overall functions correctly. So before we move on, make sure you are able to identify each of the three membrane modifications that we see depicted here in the figure. In addition to membrane modifications that hold cells together, there are also modifications of the plasma membrane that allow for movement and absorption. And these two modifications are cilia and microvilli. So take a moment and compare the two cells that you see in figures A and B. Notice in figure A that the surface of the cell is covered by many small yellow projections, which we'll highlight here with our arrow. These membrane modifications are called microvilli. Okay, and they're important because they increase the absorptive surface area of a particular tissue. Because of their function, we find cells that have these microvilli lining the digestive tract, particularly in the small intestine, which is where the majority of nutrients are absorbed. Notice in figure B, the modifications on the surface of that cell are much larger than those that we saw in figure A. Okay, these modifications here are called cilia, and their main function is to sweep substances past cells. You find cells with cilia comprising the tissues that line your respiratory tract. So these cilia are important for sweeping mucus that contains trapped dust particles and other foreign substances that you inhale back up out of your respiratory tract. The final characteristic of epithelial tissue is reproduction. Okay? These tissues are able to reproduce themselves. Now, this is obviously a very important function. If, for example, you consider your skin, for example. Okay, what happens with your skin is that dead cells are constantly wearing away, so we have to constantly replace those cells as they're lost. Okay, and this reproductive function of epithelial tissue, okay, is, of course, very important. All right, moving on, let's talk about how we classify epithelial tissue. To classify epithelial tissues, we use two main criteria, and those two criteria are the shape of the cell and the number of layers of cells. All right, focus your attention first on the left-hand side of the figure. The left-hand side of the figure shows you the three basic cell shapes that you find comprising epithelial tissue. Those three cell shapes are squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. Squamous cells are flat. Cuboidal cells have a cube shape, so they have roughly the same width and height. And columnar cells are shaped like a column. Now, when you begin looking at specific tissues, it's sometimes difficult for you to see the outer plasma membrane of each individual cell, which makes it a little difficult to identify the tissue based on shape. But the thing to remember about classifying tissues based on shape is that the shape of the nucleus is reflective of the shape of the cell overall. So, for example, if you have a squamous cell, the shape of the nucleus will be flat. If you have a cube-shaped cell, the shape of the nucleus will be spherical. And if you have a columnar cell, the nucleus will have more of an elongated oval shape. So again, the shape of the nucleus will help you to identify the shape of the cell that comprises a particular tissue. The second criterion used to classify epithelial tissues is number of layers of cells. A simple epithelial tissue is composed of a single layer of cells, and a stratified epithelial tissue is composed of multiple layers of cells. Now, although it's not depicted here in this figure, in your handout that I gave you, under shape, there's a fourth shape listed there, and that shape is pseudostratified columnar. Pseudostratified columnar cells are columnar in shape, but they have different heights. So what you see when you look at a pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue is a tissue that looks like it's composed of multiple layers of cells, hence the name pseudostratified. However, the tissue is composed of a single layer of cells, and those cells are column-shaped and have different heights. Now, this is something you'll look at more closely when you look at the specific tissue type, but when you do so, make sure that you're able to distinguish it as being composed of a single layer of cells. Now, when classifying epithelial tissues, there is something I want to warn you about, and that's when you look at stratified tissues. So on the screen here, you see an example of a stratified epithelial tissue. When looking at stratified epithelial tissues and classifying it into its correct category and naming it correctly, okay, we have to remember that these tissues are named according to the shape of the cell that's in the apical layer, or the outermost layer. So take a moment and look at the tissue sample here on the screen. Notice that as you start from the white space, okay, which represents the outermost layer of the tissue, and progress toward the intersection of the tissue, the shape of the cell appears to change. Okay, so for example, here at our orange arrow, notice that we see a distinct nucleus here, and that nucleus has a flattened shape. It looks like a pencil mark has been made on the screen there. Okay, because that cell has a flattened nucleus, that means that the cell shape overall is squamous. So the cell here is a flat cell. As we move on further down into the tissue, okay, we see cells that look like this. Okay, notice here that the nucleus has more of a round spherical shape to it. Okay, and this would indicate that the cell shape has more of a cuboidal shape overall. And moving on further, we see cells that have more of a columnar shape. Okay, notice here that the nucleus has more of an elongated oval appearance. So in classifying and naming stratified tissues, okay, we have to remember that these tissues are named according to the shape of the cell in the apical layer. So this particular tissue type that we see here, because the cells in the outermost layer are flat, this tissue is stratified squamous epithelium. Again, it's stratified because it consists of multiple layers of cells, and squamous because those apical cells have a squamous or flat shape. Make sure you keep this rule in mind as you begin looking at specific tissue types. Alright, at this point, we are going to skip through the specific epithelial tissues that you find in your notes and move on and begin talking about connective tissues. Connective tissue is the most abundant and widespread type of tissue in the body, and there are several important functions, including binding and support, protection, insulation, and transportation. One of the connective tissues that you'll look at is adipose tissue or fat tissue, and its functions include both protection and insulation. The other functions that you see listed here, again, are functions that you'll see in more detail when you begin looking at the specific connective tissues. Despite the many differences that you see between connective tissues, all connective tissues have several important characteristics in common. Okay, for example, all connective tissues arise from an embryonic tissue called mesenchyme, and all have extracellular matrix. Again, remember that matrix is that stuff that you find surrounding the cells that comprise a tissue. We said that with epithelial tissues, there's very little, if any, matrix, but with connective tissue, okay, we see different types of matrix surrounding the cells that comprise those tissues. Connective tissues may also be vascularized to varying degrees or be avascular. An example of an avascular connective tissue is cartilage. Okay, in addition to the common characteristics that we just mentioned, all connective tissues also have three important structural elements. Okay, the first of which is the ground substance. Okay, ground substance is important because it fills the spaces between cells and contains fibers. It's composed mostly of glycoproteins and sugars, and depending on the particular tissue we're talking about, the ground substance may have more of a liquid, gel-like, or very hard consistency. So for example, if we're looking at bone, bone is obviously a very hard substance, which means that the ground substance is also very hard. In contrast, something like blood, the ground substance is liquid. Okay, so as you begin looking at the specific types of connective tissues, you'll begin to see the differences in the makeup of the ground substance. All connective tissues also contain fibers. There are three types of fibers that you find in connective tissue, the first of which is collagen fibers. Collagen fibers are also called white fibers, And these fibers are very important because they provide strength in the direction of the fiber. Elastic fibers are composed of a protein called elastin. And because they're composed of this elastic protein, okay, they're sort of like rubber bands. So you can pull them and stretch them out and they'll recoil and retain their original shape. So elastic fibers, again, contain this elastin protein, and they're also called yellow fibers. Elastic fibers you find in places that are able to stretch. So, for example, you find elastic fibers in your lungs, in your skin, and also in the walls of your blood vessels. The last type of fiber are reticular fibers. These are fibers that are continuous with collagen fibers, and these fibers are important because they form a branching network that surrounds blood vessels and supports many of the tissues of your organs. All connective tissues also contain cells, and the cells of connective tissues are called blast cells. These cells include fibroblasts, chondroblasts, osteoblasts, and hematopoietic stem cells. Fibroblasts are the cells of connective tissue proper. Chondroblasts are the cells of cartilage. Osteoblasts are bone-forming cells. And finally, hematopoietic stem cells give rise to the blood cells. There are four main categories of connective tissue: connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood. And again, you'll look at examples that fit into each of these four categories when you begin looking at the specific connective tissues. All right, moving on, let's talk about nervous tissue. Okay, nervous tissue is the main component of the nervous system, which controls your body functions. So your brain and your spinal cord are composed of nervous tissue. When you look at nerve tissue in the microscope, you'll see two different types of cells, and those cells are neurons and neuroglia. The neurons are the large cells with those strange branching extensions that you see, and it's the neurons that are responsible for sending and receiving nerve impulses. The neuroglia, on the other hand, are small cells that serve to support the neurons. Muscle tissue. Okay, muscle tissue is responsible for most types of body movement, and this tissue is highly cellular and well vascularized, so it has a very rich blood supply. There are three types of muscle tissue, the first of which is skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is striated and it's under voluntary control, which means that you can tell your body to move a specific skeletal muscle. It's your skeletal muscles that attach to your skeleton that form those complexes that allow your body to move. Smooth muscle is non-striated and under involuntary control. You find smooth muscle lining your digestive tract, for example. And finally, we have cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is striated and it's under involuntary control, which is good because if we had to tell our heart to beat, most of us would be dead. Okay, so your cardiac muscle tissue that comprises your heart is under involuntary control. All right, that concludes this week's podcast. At this point, what you need to do is go through each of your handouts on tissues and do the research for each of the specific tissues that you find in the handouts. So you'll be looking for a description, location, and function for each of those tissues that you see in the handout. All of that information you can find in your textbook and your photographic atlas, so make sure you consult both of those resources as you begin to do your research. Also, make sure you do your sketches of each tissue. I find doing the sketches will help you better remember what each of those tissues look like, which will be very important when it comes time to identifying those tissues on your test. Also, make sure you use the online resources as an additional study tool for the histology unit.